Have you ever been seen only for what you fear others might judge, and not for who you truly are? In a quiet mountain town, a woman with a sack over her head was sold for $2 to a lonely lumberman. No name, no voice, just a past too heavy to carry and a face the world refused to look at. But what happens when the man who chooses her isn't looking to own but to understand? What would you do if hiding felt safer than being seen until someone saw you anyway? This is not just a tale of the Wild West. It's a story of quiet redemption, where dignity grows in silence, and healing comes not with fanfare, but with a steady hand and a soft place to land. If you've ever felt invisible, or wished someone had seen the truth beneath your scars, stay with us. This is her story, and maybe a little bit. It's yours too. A woman with a sack over her head stands silent on the auction block. No one wants her until a quiet voice offers $2. Two. The Timber Ridge town square bore the weight of too many hard seasons and not enough new beginnings. Dust hung in the air like a tired prayer. The auction platform, no taller than a wagon's axle, groaned under old wood and older tension. Men shifted in the half-light of a pine-smoked afternoon, their boots grinding into dirt, worn down by years of cattle and disappointment. Some whispered tales of the last veiled woman, sold off this side of the mountains, a widow, or maybe a witch. They said her buyer turned up blind within a fortnight. Eli Carter didn't listen to tales. Not anymore. He was a man who had buried both stories and people. He didn't need warnings carved in rumor. The auctioneer, a red-nosed man with a bark thicker than sense, raised a hand and thudded a stick against the post. Last one for the day, he called. She don't talk much. Ain't shown her face. Been quiet since Missouri. Someone in the crowd spat. Another snorted. Might be a scarecrow under there. The woman didn't flinch. Barefoot, bound at the wrists, the sack tied just above her collar. Her frame wasn't frail, but carried the weary stillness of someone who'd learned not to move unless told. The hem of her dress barely touched the floorboards. One bootlace dangled, loose and frayed. The auctioneer continued. Claims she can work, says she'll obey. $2, gentlemen. That's all I'm askin'. Who's brave or drunk enough? Laughter rippled through the crowd, thin and cruel. A man tossed a pine cone toward the platform. It landed near her feet, bounced, and rolled away. Eli stood toward the back, near the edge of the old water trough. His coat was heavy with trail dust, his hat tilted low. He hadn't come for this. He'd ridden in for salt, flour, and fresh nails for the shed roof. But when the crowd parted, just enough, when that woman with no name didn't flinch from mockery, he stepped forward. He dropped $2 into the auction box. The stick paused midair. Well now, the auctioneer blinked. You sure? Carter Eli nodded once. I ain't buying her face. The silence that followed wasn't reverent, it was stunned. Eli reached for the document, signed with a slow, measured stroke. The woman didn't move. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Speak your name, for the record. There was a pause, a breath, barely audible. Clara Bell, came the voice, soft, but clear, not afraid, just hollow, like something that had been emptied long ago. Eli's hand stilled at the edge of the table. That name at bent time, he had heard it before. Not spoken, but breathed over the crackle of a cave fire. A whisper from under a veil of frost and pain. She had pulled him from the snow, fed him bark broth, set his leg with hands more certain than gentle. He'd never seen her face, only heard a voice that sounded like this. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Instead, he offered his arm, not out of ceremony, but because the platform steps were high and her bare feet were bruised. She took it. As they passed the edge of the crowd, a few men shook their heads. One muttered, "Fool's charity." Another grunted, "Must be lonely out in those woods." They didn't look back. Bessie, the store owner, stood at her doorway, arms crossed. As Eli passed, she stepped forward and handed him a small, wrapped parcel. "Give her this," she said. "Cornmeal bread, still warm." He hesitated. "No charge," she added. "She'll need this more than you." He took it, nodded once, then kept walking, Clara at his side. As they disappeared down the trail past the churchyard, Bessie watched them with a tight grip on her apron hem. The wind tugged at the edge of her sleeves. That girl just changed that man's life, and he don't even know it yet. The trail back to the woods is long and quiet, but not all silences are empty. The sun dipped low behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the winding path. The forest pressed in from both sides, not with menace but with an ancient stillness. Evergreens stood tall like sentinels, their branches whispering in the early spring breeze. Pine needles carpeted the ground, softening the steady clop of old Bramble's hooves as he trudged behind Eli and the woman who walked without saying a word. Clara moved with a tired rhythm, her bare feet careful against root and rock. The sack remained tied, a curtain between her and the world. Once, a low branch tugged at it, catching the edge. She startled. Her hands moved fast, too fast for someone so quiet, adjusting it back with a tremble. She fought hard to still. Eli didn't comment. He just slowed his pace. A few steps later, she stumbled. The trail narrowed, a moss-slicked stone catching her heel. Eli reached out without thinking, his hand under her elbow just in time. No words, no tension. Just a steadying touch, and then release. Clara nodded faintly. Though the gesture was lost in the folds of the sack, Eli's mind flickered, unbidden, to the weight of snow once crushing his ribs and the pressure of rough hands pulling him from the brink. No questions, no demands, just survival, offered quietly. They walked on, dusk seeping into the woods. An owl called out, low and mournful. The scent of snowmelt clung to the air, earthy and clean. Old Bramble snorted once, then settled into the familiar curve of the trail. And then, at the bend, the cabin came into view. It wasn't much, just a one-room lodge of weathered pine logs, built into the rise of a slope to catch the morning sun and block the north wind. A stack of chopped wood leaned against the side, covered by tarp. The roof held moss along the shaded edge, and above the door hung a rusted horseshoe nailed to a plank crossbeam. Eli stepped forward, opened the door with a soft creak, and held it. Clara paused at the threshold, then entered slowly. Her steps barely sounded on the wooden floor. Inside, the space smelled of cedar, ash, and something faintly floral. Old linen, maybe, or a dried herb hung near the stove. He brought in the last bundle of firewood, set it near the hearth, and turned. "You pick your corner," he said. "No one's placing you anymore." Clara moved without a word. She crossed to the far wall, where the shadows were long and the view out the small window open to nothing but trees. She knelt, not collapsed, but crouched, spine straight. Her hands rested on her knees. Still veiled, Eli didn't press. He moved to the iron stove, fed it wood, and set a pot atop. Soon the air filled with the scent of rabbit stew, beans, garlic, and just enough spice to carry a memory. He worked with quiet hands, pulled cornbread from a tin wrapped in cloth, placed it on the table. 2 wooden bowls, 2 spoons. No ceremony, no chatter. He ladled the stew, one bowl after the other, and carried the first to the low shelf beside Clara. She flinched, just barely, but didn't pull away. He set it down gently, then returned to his seat at the table. Outside, the wind shifted, the flames in the stove crackled. Eli stirred his stew once, then began to eat. Minutes passed, then a small sound, barely more than a whisper. "Is that cinnamon?" He looked up. Clara's head was tilted just enough for the sack to lift slightly at the chin. Her voice was soft, but steady. Not quite curious, not quite anything, but it was hers. Eli nodded. A pinch. For memory. That night, Eli watches the fire burn down, and he remembers a cave, a scarf, and a voice that once said, "Don't die on me." The light inside the cabin had fallen to amber and shadows. Outside, the wind combed gently through the trees, stirring the pine boughs like an old lullaby. Inside, only the stove gave off warmth now, its glow flickering across the log walls, casting their quiet dance across the floorboards. Eli sat in the same chair he always did, worn at the arms, one leg shorter than the rest, so it rocked slightly, on the uneven planks. He held a tin cup of pine bark tea, steam curling lazily upward, carrying the bitter smell he had learned to love through necessity. His hand, knotted from years with an axe, cradled the cup without trembling. Across the room, in her usual place by the far wall, Clara sat motionless, still veiled, still wrapped in layers of silence, but her posture had shifted, if only slightly. One hand rested palm down on the floor, fingers splayed as if anchoring her to the moment. Eli didn't speak. Not right away. The steam warmed his face. The taste of the tea, sharp and woody, drew him back, not to the cabin, but to a time when he hadn't expected to ever see a cabin again. He had gone too far north that winter. The timber had been good straight, clean, tall, but the weather had changed fast. He'd misread the clouds, thought he had another hour. Then the slope iced under him, and his leg twisted beneath the weight of his fall. He remembered the snap, the scream he couldn't let loose, and the snow that began covering him as if it meant to bury him alive. He didn't know how long he lay there, but then there were hands, rough but careful, a grip under his arms, dragging, cold giving way to warmth, then a crackle, a scent pine, bark, smoke, and her voice. "You do not need to know who I am," she had said, "but I am not going to let you die." That voice, he hadn't heard it until today. He sipped the tea again, then reached into the inside pocket of his coat. From it, he drew a folded square of cloth, small and faded. He opened it gently. Purple wildflowers, stitched in uneven thread, no larger than a palm. The edges were frayed now, the stitching loose, but it had never left his coat, not in 3 years. Across the room, the fire cracked. Clara did not move. Eli set the cloth on the table before him. His fingers brushed it once, like a prayer. "I never forgot your voice," he said softly. It was not a question, not an accusation, just a statement spoken into the still air. In the shadows, Clara's body tensed, just barely. Her shoulders lifted, then settled again, her breath catching in the quiet. "I was half dead," Eli went on, eyes still on the cloth, snow in my lungs, fire in my leg, and then you. Pulled me from that. He paused. "You never told me your name." Clara didn't speak, but her fingers curled at her side, twitched once, almost a reach, then retreat. Eli stood, walked slowly toward the stove. He added one small log, let the flames catch again. The light grew just enough to deepen the orange glow, wrapping around the two of them like a slow, burning truth. He sat back down, took the cup again. "I knew today," he said, "when you spoke it at the auction. Clara Bell." His voice wasn't trembling, but it carried weight like something carried too long. The wind outside moaned low, pressing faint against the wooden walls. "You saved my life once. I didn't know it was you, but I know now." At sunrise, Clara finds a mirror propped on the table and a folded silk scarf beside it. The cabin stirred with morning light, soft and deliberate, sliding through the slats in the shutters and catching on the dust motes in midair. The fire in the stove had dwindled to low embers, and the faint smell of cooked bacon still clung to the rafters like a quiet promise. From outside came the steady rhythm of axe meeting wood. Eli, already at his morning chore, the thud of split logs sounding a beat that matched the breath of the forest. Clara stood alone in the center of the room. The mirror waited, tilted against a wedge of pine. Its frame was tarnished silver, edges dulled by time, but the glass had been cleaned to a soft shine. Next to it, folded with a careful hand, lay a scarf, sea green silk, the edges stitched with thread, that had seen better days, but still held. Her hands didn't move at first. She stared at the objects as though they might vanish under her gaze. The sack still hung from her head, the fabric frayed and familiar. It had become more than a covering. It had been her shield, her silence, her safety. But now it stood between her and something else. She stepped forward. Her fingertips hovered over the edge of the mirror. The wood table beneath it creaked faintly as she leaned in, the floor cold under her bare feet. She touched the mirror's surface. It was cool. With a slow, deliberate motion, Clara reached behind her neck and untied the knot. The sack loosened and slid forward, caught briefly on her brow, then dropped into her hands. She folded it once, then placed it beside the scarf. The mirror reflected what it always had, but what she had never let herself see. Her face was not monstrous, but it bore the story of a night no one else had dared write down. From her right temple, a scar curved downward, thin but deep, fading just above her jaw. It was not angry anymore, just permanent, like wind-carved stone. She studied it, breath steady. Then she picked up the scarf. It felt different from the sack lighter, cooler, more forgiving. She draped it slowly, not to hide the scar, but to frame her face, to shape what others would see before they saw everything else. She tied it at the base of her neck, fingers trembling slightly as she tucked the ends. The mirror caught something unexpected. Her mouth curved, not a grin, not even a full smile, but enough. Enough to say, "I'm still here." From the window behind her came the sound of footfalls on pine needles, the familiar crunch of Eli's boots. He passed by slowly, catching a glance through the pane. He paused, axe still in hand. She turned slightly, not fully, just enough for him to see. He didn't startle. He didn't look away. He simply nodded once, firm and simple, like a man who had seen things and kept on walking. Moments later, she heard the door creak open, then close, no words, just the gentle placement of something on the table. A biscuit, still warm. She sat in the chair nearest the mirror, scarf still in place, eyes lingering on her reflection. Outside, the sound of chopping resumed. That scarf used to be my wife's. She wore it when she needed to feel like herself again. A stranger with a long coat and colder eyes rides into Timber Ridge. He's not lost, he's hunting. The horse was dust-streaked and lean, its hooves kicking up soft clods of earth as it slowed on the rise. The rider wore a long gray coat, frayed at the hem, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face from the setting sun. Silver spurs flashed at his heels with every shift of his boots, each step on the boardwalk clinking like a clock winding down. He tethered the horse loosely outside the general store, then stepped onto the wooden sidewalk with a calm too quiet to be friendly. Across the street, Bessie stood in her doorway, arms folded, thumb rubbing the edge of her apron. Her niece, Lila, leaned on the porch rail beside her, watching with a mix of awe and unease. "That man smells of trouble," Bessie muttered, like a snake in Sunday boots. Inside the general store, the stranger didn't browse. He asked, plain and direct, did anyone know a man named Carter? Did he live near Timber Ridge? Did he keep company with a woman, quiet type? Maybe scarred, maybe veiled. His voice didn't rise or fall, but his eyes moved fast, noting every reaction, every twitch. When he made it to Bessie's counter, she played it careful. "Plenty of men out near the ridge," she said, "plenty of women too." He didn't blink. "Not like her." The pause stretched long. Bessie shrugged. "Folks keep to themselves up that way, especially Carter. If you're looking to borrow sugar, you're better off elsewhere." He tipped his hat. Polite as poison, just passing through. But as he turned, she saw it how his eyes narrowed at the mention of Carter, how the corner of his mouth twitched like a man recognizing prey. Later, behind the blacksmith's shop, Eli spotted him. One glance. That was enough. Eli didn't go near. He didn't ask questions. He knew the type. Too clean to be a trapper. Too quiet to be a drifter. That stillness, the kind that came from tracking something too long. Eli watched him walk, watched the spurs, the set of his shoulders. Then Eli went home. The sun had almost dipped behind the ridge by the time he reached the cabin. The trees were taller in the fading light, their shadows drawn long like old stories stretching across the earth. Inside, Clara sat near the hearth, needle in hand, stitching along the edge of a pale cloth. Her scarf was folded beside her. Her movements were even, her posture relaxed in a way that had become familiar. Eli stepped in, shut the door behind him, hung his hat. Clara looked up. "He's hunting you," Eli said. She didn't flinch. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Clara laid her needle across the arm of the chair, then rose slowly. She walked to the cedar chest at the foot of the cot, lifted the lid, reached in. Her fingers found the old sack, still folded where she'd left it weeks before. She held it in both hands, looked down at the coarse fabric. "Then I'll wear it one more time," she said quietly. Eli stepped forward. "You don't have to." She turned to him, her eyes clear. "This time, I choose it, not for shame, for strategy. Clara rides out at dawn, sackcloth tied tight, but this time, it's not fear she wears." The first light of morning brushed the tops of the pine trees, filtering through mist that clung to the forest floor like secrets not ready to rise. The trail was soft from night moisture, the horses' hooves barely sounding as they moved along the old fire road. Clara sat tall in the saddle, her back straight, hands steady on the reins. The sackcloth was snug over her head, tied with practiced hands, but not trembling ones. Eli's voice echoed faint in her mind. This time, you choose what they see. And she had, not for concealment, but for control. Behind her, no more than 2 bends of trail, came Ryland. She didn't need to look to know he followed. She could feel him the way a rabbit senses a hawk's shadow present, watchful, waiting. His horse kept to the trail just far enough to keep from raising dust, but close enough. She didn't ride fast. Panic would spoil the trap. She needed him certain she was alone, that she was weak. At the ravine's mouth, the trail dipped sharply. To one side, a thin creek ran low with spring melt. On the other, a rock outcrop curved into a shallow hollow. Perfect for hiding. Sheriff Merton waited there, along with 2 deputies from Ridge Patrol. Eli had ridden cross-trail hours before to set the meeting. He arrived with calm urgency, gave the plan, kept it simple. Clara would draw Ryland in. The law would close the door. Now she was the bait. The trail narrowed. Her horse hesitated. She patted its neck gently and pressed it forward. Around the next bend, the trees thinned. She could see the shadowed rise of the ravine wall. One more turn. Behind her, the soft jingle of spurs. She slowed, let her horse trot lightly through a patch of wet leaves. She tilted her head, just enough for her voice to carry, but not enough to reveal her face. "Please, I'm just trying to get clear." No answer, just a tightening of reins. He thought she was pleading. She pressed on. As she entered the dip, she caught sight of Eli just barely, a silhouette in the pine shade above the hollow. His rifle wasn't drawn, but his jaw was set. Beside him, Sheriff Merton crouched low, signaling to the deputies with a hand. Ryland crested the bend seconds later. His horse blew steam from its nostrils. He pulled up, surveyed the drop ahead, then eased his hand toward the gun on his hip. He called out, low and sure, "That's far enough." Clara didn't turn. "You run real well for someone wanted dead or alive," he said. She stopped her horse. He started to dismount. That was the signal. From both sides of the ravine, the deputies burst forward, boots pounding dirt and bark. One shouted, "Drop it." Another flanked from the left, weapon raised. Ryland spun, gun half drawn, but Sheriff Merton's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't even think it." In less than a breath, Ryland was tackled, disarmed, and forced to the ground. The sack he carried in his satchel spilled out a rope, cuffs, and a folded piece of paper marked with Clara's name, in bold type. She watched from the saddle, unmoving. Ryland cursed under his breath as they tied his wrists. His eyes found Clara's veiled figure, and for the first time, something shifted in them. Not confusion, not even fear. Recognition. He sneered. "Should have burned that place to the ground when I had the chance." Clara didn't answer. Her hands didn't shake. She kept her eyes steady behind the fabric. Only when the sheriff stood and turned to her did she move. He tipped his hat. "You all right?" Miss Clara nodded once, eyes steady, with Ryland gone. Clara removes the sack for the last time, not with shame, but with grace. The woods had gone quiet in a way they hadn't for weeks. Not silent, but softened, an echo of relief hung in the warm morning light. Clara felt it in her spine, not quite relief, but something like release. A pressure valve had opened and let something old and tight slip away. The creek beside the clearing murmured peacefully, and pine needles underfoot exchanged gentle crunches as she shifted her weight. She remained in the saddle for a moment, gathering herself. The late morning sun filtered through tall pines, dappling the ground with shifting patterns. Light warmed her shoulders through the thick wool coat she still wore. Her breath came steady, slow, matching the pace of her heart. She turned her head, glancing once upstream at the place where Sheriff Merton and his deputies had retreated with Ryland. Their forms receded, voices low, absorbed by the forest's hush. Clara gave old Bramble's neck a pat, then swung her leg over and stepped down. Her boots landed softly on the trail solid, sure. The earth gave gentle resistance, reassuring her that she stood in one place. She looked up once more at the sky glimpsed through the canopy, cloudless and wide. She reached behind her neck, one hand finding the knot at the base of the sack. Her fingers touched the coarse fabric, heavy with old fear and quiet battles. She paused, yet again, fingertips resting on the knot. A memory stirred of nights spent alone, of hiding not just her face, but the woman she was, of voices behind her, whispering, judging, casting stones. She felt the weight of those moments settle around her shoulders, like a burden she'd carried too long. Then she tugged. The knot gave with a soft rustle. The sack slid forward, caught momentarily at her brow, before spilling into her waiting hands. Its coarse weave felt rough under her fingertips. She brought it down carefully, held it for a heartbeat, then folded it once, then again, meticulously. It was no longer a prison. It had become a relic. Eli stepped closer. He remained quiet, no congratulations. No words of reassurance, just presence. That quiet solidarity that had carried her through every hard night since she arrived. She felt it in the space beside her, in the calm that passed between them. Clara lifted her eyes. Meeting his, "It saved me again," she said, voice even, steady as stone, "not because it hid me, but because I used it." The early spring light wove through her scarf, illuminating the delicate sea-green silk she had chosen herself. It framed her face, gathered strength around her scar. The scar itself, thin now and pale, curved from temple to cheek, etched, but not unforgiving. It was part of her story without owning it. Eli's eyes softened. He looked past the scarf, past the scar, to the woman who stood there tall, quiet, unbroken. He nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. His jaw relaxed, and the tension of the past days, the fear, the planning, the trap, all slipped from his shoulders like exhaled breath. Clara exhaled too, slowly, letting her posture unfold. She tucked the folded sack into a pocket of her coat, a reminder she wouldn't let slip away. She handed a rein to Eli and gestured toward the creek trail. "Let's walk a bit." They moved slowly, side by side, the scent of wet earth and pine filling their lungs. Wind swept through the pines, and a bird called a single note, breaking into the canopy as if celebrating the shift in the woods. It wasn't song, exactly, but hope, held in sound. After a few steps, they stopped again, near an old tree stump. Eli set the reins down, leaning old Bramble's head to hand-feed a handful of oats. The mule chewed leisurely. Content, Clara knelt beside the stump, placed the sack on a mossy shelf at its base. She smoothed the folds, arranged it with care. "I'll keep it, not as a cage. As proof," she said again, voice barely above the breeze. Eli joined her, crouching beside the sack. His hand hovered over it, but didn't grip. Instead, he pressed it lightly against the wood. Proof of what Clara looked up, her gaze steady and clear, that I survived, that I chose when to hide, not for shame, but for strategy, and that I was never broken, even when they wanted me to be. He nodded slowly. "That sounds like the bravest thing any of us can do." They stood together for a moment in the filtered sunlight. Pines swayed overhead. Shadows played across the ground. The creek's babble rose and fell. Eli folded his hands behind his back. "You ready to head home?" Clara brushed a stray pine needle from her coat. "Whenever you're ready." They mounted again, riding in the same place Clara had dismounted. Soft hooves touched the trail, Clara's grip on the reins was confident now, not tense, but assured. They turned together toward Timber Ridge, leaving the clearing behind. As they rode, Clara felt the sack ride heavy in her pocket, a small weight she'd never discard, a memory she carried by choice. Behind them, the forest exhaled a bird's trill, its branches parting to let light through. The woods no longer looked like walls. They looked like a path forward. Clara swallowed once, then quietly said so low only Eli could hear, "Thank you." He glanced at her. For riding home, she didn't smile, but in her eyes, he saw it something that looked very close. A knock comes, at dusk, slow, respectful. Eli opens the door to find a man holding a worn leather bag. The day had folded into evening gently, with long shadows stretching across the clearing, like tired arms reaching for rest. Inside the cabin, the oil lamp on the table cast a soft circle of gold that flickered with each subtle breath of wind. The stove radiated gentle heat, and the scent of pine smoke clung to the rafters like memory. Clara sat near the hearth, knitting quietly, her scarf tied loose around her shoulders now. The sea-green fabric a comforting presence, rather than armor. When the knock came, Eli stood from his place near the window and crossed the room without a word. It was not a demanding knock, not urgent, not impatient, just 3 deliberate taps that seemed to ask permission more than announce presence. He opened the door. On the porch stood an older man, his frame stooped but solid, a broad-brimmed hat held respectfully in both hands. A leather satchel hung from his shoulder, worn at the seams, his eyes clouded slightly with age, found Eli's without hesitation. "Evenin'," the man said. His voice was rough with time, but held a careful weight. "Name's Merritt. Used to be a medic. Served with the Northern Line Field hospitals. Mostly?" Eli studied him for a breath before stepping aside. "Come in." Clara had risen halfway to her feet at the sound of the name. Now she stood fully, frozen in place, as Merritt stepped into the cabin's warmth. His gaze found her the way someone might spot a star they feared had already gone out. "Clara Bell," he said gently. "You remember me?" She nodded once, her voice a whisper. "Doc Merritt." He placed his bag on the table, then looked at her for a long moment. "You saved more lives than most men ever get the chance to try. Always quiet, always steady. We thought you were a ghost. The way you moved through those tents." Her eyes glistened, but she did not cry. "Not yet," Doc Merritt continued, voice thick with something he hadn't planned to carry in. "I remember the night you ran. I was there." Clara sat slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "I saw him follow you into that back room," Doc said, his voice low. "Saw the way he grabbed your wrist. I heard the struggle. When I got there, it was too late. He'd already hit his head. You were frozen, scared out of your skin." He paused. "I should have spoken up then. Should have told the truth. But he swallowed. I was tired, afraid. The war had taken too much already." Clara's voice trembled, but she met his eyes. "You didn't lie, but you didn't speak." Doc nodded slowly. "And I've lived with that weight. When I heard where you were, I came to fix what I could." Eli moved toward the table, placed a clean page beside Doc's worn bag. Ink and quill followed. Doc reached into his coat and pulled out a folded statement already prepared, the words carefully written. He placed it flat, uncapped the inkwell, and dipped the pen. The sound of the nib against the paper was small, but it filled the room. Scratch. Pause. Scratch again. His hand shook once, but the signature came clear and full. When he finished, Eli stepped forward and signed below as witness. Clara remained seated, her gaze never leaving the man before her. When he set the pen down, she reached forward, laying her hand over his. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming back." Doc smiled, a crease spreading through his weathered cheeks. "It's never too late to stand beside the truth," he said. "But it takes someone brave enough to live it." Clara wakes to find the sackcloth washed, sun-dried, and trimmed with white thread folded gently beside a mirror. Morning light drifted through the cabin window in soft beams, scattering golden flecks across the wooden floor. The air smelled faintly of lilac, drawn in from the patch Eli had planted near the porch, and of worn linen, sun-warmed and folded the night before. The fire had burned low, but the air held no chill. It was the kind of morning that didn't need to announce itself. It simply arrived and settled gently into the bones. Clara stirred from the cot, blanket slipping from her shoulders. She sat up slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the table where the mirror stood, angled perfectly to catch the morning light, and there beside it, folded with careful hands, lay the sackcloth. But it was no longer the same. The fabric, once coarse and stained, had been washed until the brown faded to a soft earth tone. Along its edge, a neat row of white thread now lined the hem, stitched with the kind of patience that only comes with intention. At the corners, faint purple wildflowers had been embroidered tiny, uneven, unmistakably familiar. The same kind, once stitched into a cloth, she'd left behind years ago in snow. Clara drew in a slow breath and picked it up. The weight was the same, but what it carried had changed. It no longer whispered shame or flight. It spoke of memory, of choice, of resilience forged quietly. She lifted the cloth and draped it over her head, not to hide her face, but to carry her past. It rested lightly against her crown, sheer enough to let the light through, soft enough to catch the shape of the woman she had become. She stood and crossed to the mirror. The reflection looking back was not hidden. It was framed purposefully. Her eyes met themselves without flinching. The scar was still there, it always would be, but so was everything else. And it was hers now, every piece. Outside, she heard soft footsteps and a brief knock. She opened the door to find Mavis standing beside little Emily, the girl from town who had once handed her bread without asking why she never showed her face. Emily smiled and offered a bouquet of wildflowers, freshly gathered from the field behind the cabin lilies, daisies, clover, and a few sprigs of lavender. "For you," she said. Clara took it, her fingers brushing the petals like they might dissolve under touch. "Thank you," she said. They walked together toward the small clearing behind the cabin, where Eli had spent the past week shaping pine beams into a modest arch. It stood tall, wrapped in simple linen, 2 wooden chairs placed beneath it, surrounded by spring bloom, nothing grand, just honest. Eli waited there, his boots polished, shirt pressed as neat as could be expected. He had shaved for the first time in weeks. His beard, usually rugged and streaked with sawdust, was now trimmed, jawline clean. He looked more himself than she'd ever seen him. In his hand, he held something small and round, a ring carved from old oak, worn smooth and oiled with care. He looked at her with nothing but quiet certainty. Clara stepped forward. Her hands held the bouquet. Her veil fluttered softly in the breeze. She smiled not with defense, not with hesitation, but with peace. Her past was not erased. It was present, and it was hers. Eli extended his hand, eyes never leaving hers. "Shall we?" he asked. Under a linen-draped arch, two souls once lost to judgment stand in quiet promise. The field behind the cabin had never seen a ceremony, but this morning it seemed to hold its breath in reverence. Wildflowers bloomed where the grass had grown unchecked. The pine trees stood as natural walls, tall and protective, swaying slightly with the early spring breeze. And beneath the arch that Eli had built with quiet care, Clara stood with her veil loose around her shoulders and her heart open in a way it hadn't been in years. There was no priest, no pages read from a book, just the people who mattered, the ones who had stayed, and a promise exchanged in the presence of wind, sunlight, and truth. "You were always the woman I chose," Eli said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The veil never changed that. Clara looked up at him, her fingers warm around the bouquet Emily had picked. "And you were the man who waited for me to become who I already was." The crowd wasn't large, just a half circle of quiet neighbors: Doc Merritt, his cane resting against his leg, Bessie, holding a fresh loaf wrapped in linen, the blacksmith with his suspenders too tight and his heart too soft, and Emily, who stood beside Mavis, with her small hands clasped in anticipation. Clara and Eli each held a ring. Hers was carved from a silver coin, softened around the edges by Eli's file, the inside etched faintly with the date they first met. His was pine simple, strong, cut from the same wood as the arch above them. They slipped the rings onto each other's hands without ceremony. Only intention. No thunder, no grand declarations, just a steady silence. And then, a kiss. It wasn't long or showy, but it held weight. Years of healing folded into a single breath. The crowd clapped. Not loud, but full of warmth. Not for spectacle, but for the quiet courage of what they had just witnessed. Bessie stepped forward first, handing Eli the bread. "To break together," she said. Doc Merritt followed, offering a small flask of apple brandy. "To remind you life still has sweetness," he said. They shared a small meal there in the field. Clara laughed once, soft, surprised at herself. Mavis wiped at her eyes and blamed the pollen. Later, as the sun began to shift lower in the sky, Clara stepped to the edge of the clearing. She carried the veil in her hands. She laid it gently across a flat stone near the tree line, letting the silk catch in the breeze. Then, after a moment, she picked it up again and folded it once more. Not to hide, not to bury, but to keep, to remember. Eli came to her side. "Whatever covered your face," he said quietly, "it never hid your worth." Clara turned to him. The trees behind them moved gently, and the linen over the arch fluttered one last time before stilling again. She looked at him, her voice even. "I used to hide from this world. Now it holds me like home." The veil that once served as Clara's hiding place became her crown beneath an arch of pine and linen, surrounded by those who chose compassion over suspicion. In that quiet field, where judgment had once echoed louder than truth, kindness took root. Sometimes the most powerful choice we can make is to see beyond what the world insists on hiding. When we stop judging by appearances, we begin to understand what real dignity means, offering grace without needing a reason. So if this story stirred something in you, let it be a gentle reminder. A single kind act, unseen or unsaid, can change the course of another's life. Like wind moving through the trees, it leaves no mark, but everything listens. Thank you for joining us on this journey of courage, compassion, and quiet redemption. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who needs it, and subscribing to our channel for more stories that echo through time. Your support helps keep these voices alive.